mute everybody, David, and begin the record. Well, good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Topeka. My name is Walt Racker. I'll be your moderator this morning. Thank you for the gift of your time. Whether you're in your home office or driving your semi down the interstate, we welcome you. Whether you are fully vaccinated, uncertain about the booster, or if you're learning the Greek alphabet to prepare for the next variant, we welcome you. No matter who you love, the color of your skin, your beliefs, or your age, you are welcome here. Carolyn Ward is going to light the chalice for us and read a poem by Willa Cather. And I think you're on mute, Carolyn.
Yes, Carolyn, you're on mute.
There we go.
There we go. All right. You're going to have to imagine fire because I'm still in a hotel, so they don't allow flames. So visualize flames. Prairie Dawn by Willa Cather. A crimson fire that vanquishes the stars. A pungent odor from the dusty sage. A sudden stirring of the huddled herds. A breaking of the distant tablelands. Through purple mists ascending and the flare of water ditches silver in the light, a swift bright lance curled low across the world, a sudden sickness for the hills of home.
Thank you, Carolyn. Joys and concerns, birthdays and anniversaries. Willow turned 9 this week. Skylar Starr's birthday is February 3rd. Congratulations to Barry and Kathy Molyneux on their 10th wedding anniversary. We send best wishes to Susie for her continued improvement after her eye surgery. Are there any other joys or concerns and birthdays? Hearing none. Announcements. Next Sunday's program will continue our practice of beginning each month with a program focusing on racism, and this will also be via Zoom. The program committee is looking for additional members, so please contact Rob Cook, David Schaefer, or me if you have programming ideas during our ministerial interregnum. Susie Loy needs volunteers to help with the plant sale that's planned for this spring. And don't forget, the first Sunday of the month is when we replenish our blessing box. And as we are enjoying our program this morning, is a good time to write a check for your pledge this month. Our expenses continue even though we are not meeting in person, so we appreciate your generosity. So we have a special program today. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jim Hoy. He was reared on a small ranch in the Kansas Flint Hills near Cassaday. He's Professor Emeritus of English and the Director Emeritus of the Center for Great Plains Studies at Emporia State University, where he taught for over 45 years. He holds a BS from Kansas State University, an MA from Emporia State, and a PhD from the University of Missouri. He's an authority on the folk life of ranching, a topic which he has lectured in England, Germany, New Zealand, and Australia. Among his 18 books are The Cattle Guard, Its History and Lore, Flint Hills Cowboys, Cowboy's Lament, Life on the Open Range, and most recently, My Flint Hills, winner of the Byron Caldwell Smith Award from KU for 2021. He has served as president of the Kansas Historical Society, president of the American Association of Australian Literary Studies, chair of the board of the Symphony of the Flint Hills, and chair of the board of trustees of the American Folk Life Center, at the Library of Congress. In 2004, he was inducted into the Kansas Cowboy Hall of Fame. In April, he will receive the Chester A. Reynolds Award from the National Cowboy Museum and Western Heritage Center in Oklahoma City. I met Dr. Hoy in 1970 while I was doing graduate studies in English. He was my teacher, my advisor, and my friend. He invited us to one of the best folk music jams I've ever participated in, and this was the night before our daughter Hillary was born. His scholarly interests are surprisingly rich and varied, so whether you want to learn about the ballads of Banjo Patterson, the wagon-drawn dramatic plays of the medieval trade guilds, Chaucer's garden imagery and the Canterbury Tales, whom to watch in the Strong City Rodeo this June, or the geography of the Flint Hills, you need to look no further than Jim Hoy. Please welcome Dr. Jim Hoy. Jim?
Yeah, thanks, Walt. Gosh, 1970, I knew it was back in there sometime. That's a long time back. Yeah. And I appreciate the Christmas cards you send every year, and I'm getting a little collection of guitar picks that you send along too. That's nice. I appreciate it. You're right. I taught 45 years or more there at Emporia State University, many different classes. But my two favorites were the folklore class, two of my favorites, folklore class and the Flint Hills folk life class. Now, I'm going to start this talk with a Kansas myth. Folklore, a lot of people think folklore is kind of the equivalent of an old wives' tale, and it's something that's not true. Not quite right. Folklore is always valid. It might not be true, but it's valid because it's what ordinary people think, believe in, the things they do in their life. It's sort of the basis of ordinary life. We in our society have set up many institutions to pass on information from a younger generation to prepare them for adult life. School systems, of course, from preschool through university is the major one of these, I suppose, but things like, churches and art galleries and historical museums, various other things that we have set up as a society to provide information to coming generations to prepare them for adult life. That's formal education. I look at folklore as kind of an informal education. You learn things there by observing other people, by someone telling you, hey, do it this way, not out of a book, not out of formal instruction. If you think back to your grade school days, early grade school days, you learned a lot at recess and you learned a lot on the school bus that they didn't teach in the classroom. When you got home and said some of those things, told some of those things to your mother, you might have got scolded and your mouth washed out with soap. But those are items of information that we consider important for future generation to have. That's folklore. Anyway, to a folklorist, a myth is folk religion. It may or may not be connected to Christianity or Islam or another form of religion, but it's a myth is a story with embodies deep truths about a society, about a culture, about the way people live their lives. So myth to folklorist, folk religion, folk history to folklorist is legend, a story that had a basis of something that actually happened at one time, and people tell that story over and over down through generations, through hundreds of years sometimes. And over those years, it gains details that probably didn't occur in the actual event, but it's told as a truth, received as truth. It's folk history. And then there are folk tales, folk literature, stories that are told for the fun of it. They may be attempted to lead you along and present it as something that happened, but then there'll be a catch to it and you realize, oh, I've been had. But jokes are folk tales, and the internet's an excellent place now. They're passing on jokes rather than word of mouth. To go back to the myth, I want to start this talk with a Kansas myth. And that was about a little Mennonite girl named Anna Barkman. Anna Barkman was raised in the Ukraine, and in the 1870s, her father decided they were going to immigrate to the United States. They're going to come to Kansas. He had done some looking, some investigating, and he had determined that the soils in Kansas were similar to those in the Ukraine. The climate was similar to their climate, and he thought maybe that the crop that he grew there on his farm would be a good one to grow in Kansas. And that crop was turkey red winter wheat. We'd been raising wheat in Kansas, spring wheat, which you plant in February, March, and harvest in the summer. Winter wheat, hard red winter wheat, you plant in the fall and harvest in the summer. Turkey red wheat was a great innovation for Kansas. Anyway, he wants to raise some wheat when he comes to Kansas. So he sends his little daughter, Anna, 8 or 10 years old, out to the granary with 2 big jugs. And he said, I want you to fill these jugs with wheat. We'll use it for seed. But he said, I don't want you to just fill them up. You could do that in a matter of minutes. I want you to sort that wheat out, to spread it out, and pick out the fattest, thickest, healthiest looking kernels you can, and one at a time fill those jugs, which she did. Hard work, tiresome work, unpleasant work. It's dusty in that granary. There are insects all over the place. There are mice and rats. There's snakes after the mice. It's not a pleasant place to be, and it's very slow, time-consuming, dirty work. She'd much rather be at the house helping her mother. She'd rather be out in the yard playing with the neighbor kids, whatever. But no, her father gave her this job, and she does it the best she can. They come to Kansas. Her father plants that wheat, and what do you know? The next thing you know, we're the wheat state. If Kansas were an independent nation, we would be the 12th largest wheat producing country in the world. That's how much wheat we grow here. So, and that's thanks to Anna Barkman, right? Not quite. Think how long it would take, how many years it would take to turn those 2 jugs of wheat into enough seed to plant enough wheat in this state to make it the wheat state. Another Mennonite, a man named Bernard Warkentine, who lived in Newton, was a businessman, and he imported wheat by the boatload. That's how we became the wheat state. But the myth of Anna Barkman is a much more fun thing. And besides, I think she embodies the Kansas character. We're the day after Kansas Day, the day 1861, January 29th, when we joined the State of the Union. I think it was 36th state, if I remember correctly. Anyway, I think Kansas today is kind of a laughing stock. Back when Johnny Carson wanted to get a laugh on late night radio, he'd just say, mention the name Kansas, and everybody would chuckle. You ask people today, you tell them you're from Kansas, they'll say, they say, how's Dorothy? You know, what's the Wizard of Oz doing? So we kind of degenerated into that. But at one point, we were a leader, politically, culturally, morally, a leader. William Allen White, the great Kansas journalist, said that if it's going to happen in the country, it'll happen in Kansas first. And many things did. Some of them were good. Some of them, like Prohibition, were good on the idea, but not so good in actual practice. Anyway, Anna Barkman, I think, embodies the Kansas character, what a true Kansan is really like. She's quiet, she's unassuming, she didn't seek attention, downplayed things, did her duty. Her father asked her to do a job, that's what she did. Even though it was an unpleasant job, she didn't make anything out of it. That was a duty she had, and she did it. As Kansans, we don't expect to get rich quick. Most of us don't expect to get rich. We hope to make a good living. If we don't, we keep on struggling anyway. But we're not like the Texans, where everything is big and everyone wants to get rich in a hurry. We don't brag about ourselves. We don't boast like the Coloradans boast about their mountains or 12,000 foot, they're 13,000, 14,000 foot mountains they're so proud of. We have mountains in Kansas, but we don't brag about them. I'm not talking about my home, the Flint Hills. I'm not talking about the Smoky Hills, not talking about the Gypsum Hills. I'm talking about granite mountains that geologists tell me look like the Front Range at Denver. But because we're Kansans and don't like to draw attention to ourselves, we keep them buried 800 feet underground. The Nemaha Ridge, the Nemaha Mountains run from Hiawatha down to Winfield. And they're, the geologists say it's a wonderful granite mountain range, but we keep them buried because we're Kansans. We don't like to make a big fuss about stuff. Yeah. Okay, so we do our duty. We don't complain. We don't expect to get rich quick. We're self-effacing. We do what we need to. We do what was asked of us. And that, I think, explains pretty much the Kansas character. Now, I can't say that all Kansans live up to that. I can't say that all people even born and raised in Kansas meet the criteria, but in my mind, that pretty much defines what we are as a people, what other people think of us as a people. They might think of us as kind of backward, but they also know that we're hardworking here and that we are do what we ought to do what we're supposed to do. Now, another thing about Kansas, I think, is that we are, every country has certain iconic figures, certain iconic residents. And in America, the United States of America, I can think of 3 of those right off the top of my head. I'm sure there are others. But one is the yeoman farmer, the Jeffersonian yeoman farmer, the pioneer farmer, the American Indian, and the cowboy. Those 3 occupations, those 3 figures in our country are define us as Americans. The Jeffersonian notion, he wanted this country filled with small farms all over the place. It didn't work out that way. Technology. Someone I heard talking before this started that the first district in Kansas, the big one they call it, starts at the Colorado border and keeps going farther and farther and farther east. It has lost population ever since 1900. They keep having to expand the geographical range of the first district when they have, set up congressional districts. And the one reason for that, of course, is that technology. You don't have when Thomas Jefferson had the Homestead Act passed, he figured that one farm family and 160 acres would take care of that Louisiana Purchase. That would be a good use for it. His original plan for the Louisiana Purchase was that it'd be a home for the Indians of the East. He'd send those Native Americans to get them out of Florida and the Carolinas and Kentucky and sent them back out in the West. Jefferson bought Louisiana in 1803, and he figured at the time it would take at least 300 to 400 years for it to fill up. In 1890, the Census Bureau, less than 100 years, fewer than 100 years after Jefferson bought Louisiana, the Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. It filled up. There were various reasons for that. One was the Homestead Act, as I mentioned. One was the transcontinental railroads. If they were going to build across here, they needed farmers here that could ship their crops and livestock back, make money, and ship supplies out to them and so on. So the Homestead Act, the cross-continental railroads, and changing the myth from the Great American Desert, let's start calling it the Garden of the World. Instead of the Great American Desert, people aren't going to move to a desert, but they'll move to a garden. And therefore I will give them names that attract them: Sweetwater, Texas; Wheatland, Wyoming; Goodland, Kansas; Garden City, Kansas. Draw these people out to this area, and it did. They filled up. It was good. Jefferson's notion was that the 160, or Lincoln's notion, building on Jefferson's idea of the pioneer farmer, 160 acres would support a family. And he expected this land. And of course, Kansas is cut up into sections, isn't it? Pretty easy to cut up a flat area into sections. And most of the Great Plains, that's happened to it. Certainly here in Kansas. But as I mentioned, once technology's over, once they got steam engines, they got tractors, they got plows and things like that, it takes fewer and fewer people to run a farm. I remember when I was a kid, we'd occasionally plant a little wheat, and the neighbor had a threshing machine, and other neighbors would come in and help us thresh our wheat, thresh our oats, and then we'd go help them, go help them, go help them. Now, one man on a huge, huge combine can harvest sections of land, thousands and thousands and thousands of acres, all by himself. And they're coming up with machines, tractors, other motorized machines that, like automobiles, electric automobiles, are not going to need an operator. They can run remotely. You set the switches in them, and they'll do it all by themselves. Plow it, plant it, harvest it, plow it, plant it, harvest it. Takes fewer and fewer people to produce more and more livestock, more and more crops. And so Kansas, which was originally overwhelmed by rural residents, is now overwhelmed by Topeka, Wichita, and Johnson County. Those three major areas, and other large areas, Hutchinson, Salina, Garden City, the metropolitan areas, many more people live in town now than they do in the country. But still, that picture of the pioneer farmer, if you ever seen the statue of Pioneer Woman in Council Grove or down in Ponca City, Oklahoma, that iconic covered wagon with the family walking beside it, pulled by a team of mules or a team of oxen, that is one of the major icons of the United States. And Kansas is right in the center of that icon. We helped create that. American Indians. When Columbus first invaded this land, discovered it, I suppose one should say, but he invaded it actually, there were something like 500 or more different tribal groups in North America. over 500. Today, well, I used to do a quiz when I taught a class called American Indian in Literature. And I started that class with a quiz. I'd say, name 3 male Indians. I started saying name 3 female Indians. I cut it down to 2 because nobody could name more than 2. Name 5 Indian tribes. And invariably, the male Indians were Geronimo, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, sometimes Chief Joseph. The Indians were always Pocahontas and Sacagawea. But the Indian tribes, name 5 Indian tribes, overwhelmingly, they named the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, the Comanche. The only tribe, not a Plains tribe, was the Cherokee, got named a lot. Also the Osage, the Kansan, Arapaho. 500 different tribal units in this country, from the birch bark paddling woodland Indians in the Northeast to the large wooden mud pyramid builders of the Southeast, to the Pueblo Indians of the Southwest, to California Indians, to the Northwest country where they went out in boats and hunted whales out there in the ocean. Tribes in the Great Basin area that had a very, very poor existence. They turned over rocks and ate whatever insects they could find. All these different tribal units, yet the students always named majority, if not all, Plains Indians when I asked them to name an Indian tribe. Why was that? Partly the movies, because movies all pretty much show Plains Indians, but partly because the Plains were the last area to get settled. The East is settled, those Indians are, acclimated or moved out or whatever. And then we jump to the West Coast. The gold rush caused the West Coast be settled before the middle country, the Great American Desert. So, and then of course you had the Santa Fe Trail, so you're settling down in that area. And you have the Oregon Trail settling up in Oregon, Washington. So you have those Indian tribes and the ones in the East, but the ones that get mentioned are the ones in the Great Plains and the Southwest, the Apache, the Kiowa, Cheyenne, Comanche, the Sioux. They were the last to be defeated. And as the last, they are the foremost in our collective minds. They also were very colorful. They were horse Indians. They didn't have horses till the Spanish got here and brought horses, but boy, they adapted early. The anthropologists think that people go from hunter-gatherers to farmers to cities and governments. The Cheyenne Indians were farmers. They got forced out onto the plains. Within a generation, they forgot how to farm. They became horse Indians. And only later on then had to pick up farming again. The point is that the horse, of course, is a colorful creature. The horse is it's a symbol of the ruling class. A knight in England, the upper class. The cavalier in France, the upper class. The caballero in Spain, the upper class. And then, of course, out in Asia, Genghis Khan and all those mounted Mongols. The horseman has always been the ruling class, the ideal, the symbol. And there those Indians were, superb horsemen. Both the Comanche and the Cheyenne were called by people who knew the best mounted cavalry in the world. They were amazing. if you can imagine riding a bareback horse at full speed, circling your enemy, and your heel hooked over the hip bone, and you're leaning underneath the horse's neck and shooting arrows. That sounds impossible to me. I cannot possibly imagine it. And yet many people who witnessed it wrote about it. May it be a little exaggeration, but they were superb horsemen, horse warriors. The Plains Indian is, in the American mind, the American Indian. Of those major Plains tribes, how many of them were in Kansas? The Comanche, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Sioux. They got down here hunting. I mentioned the Kiowa, I think. Yeah. The Osage, of course. Yeah. The Osage and the Kansan, for whom the state is named. The only Eastern tribe that got mentioned in that quiz I gave, and the only Eastern tribe that gets much notoriety at all, the Cherokee. And of course, that's the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Creek and the Seminole were all forced out of their eastern homes on trails of tears and forced out into Kansas and Oklahoma. Cherokee Reservation was originally in southern Kansas. Of course, Shawnee County, named for the Shawnee Indians, where the reservation was. Many other Indian reservations in Kansas, but when it began to settle up, they moved all those down into Oklahoma, up into the Dakotas, down into Arizona, New Mexico. But those iconic Indian tribes, all Kansas tribes. Then we get to the American cowboy. The American cowboy is our true folk hero here, the iconic folk hero of America. It's kind of interesting that this kind of a really rough sort of a guy who not all that, concerned with cleanliness, who wasn't all that concerned with the niceties of society or law or whatever. Very low paid, a hired man on horseback, he's been called. When he was driving cattle to Kansas, he got paid well, but he only did that 3 or 4 months a year. At the time, he didn't have a job, not one that didn't pay very much, $20, $30 a month maybe. It was the cowboy became the American folk hero. Now, why was that? Daniel Boone, he replaced Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone was the folk hero, but the dime novel switched from the Boone character to the cowboy character there in the later 1900s, and the American cowboy became the folk hero. And I've often kind of wondered why that is. The movies, of course, really play him up and all that, but he's why has he become such an icon of America? And without Kansas, there would be no cowboy. The cowboy, as we know him, developed in the trail drives that followed the Civil War from Texas into Kansas. There had been drovers who drove cattle before, back east all over the country. There had been herders who herded livestock back east, out west, all over the country. But the cowboy got his image and his name in the years after the Civil War, the early 1870s. The drover from Texas got turned into a cowboy. That's what they started calling him. And that, as I said, without Kansas, without those cow towns here, he would not have come into existence. Why has he become this stock figure in movies that, even though he might be a little on the dodgy side, eventually brings right to the fore? The Shane story in many different forms. the farmer, the nice, peaceful, easygoing farmer who is the harbinger of civilization. You don't have churches, you don't have schools, you don't have towns, stores without the farmers. And here they are moving out on the plains. And just as the cattlemen had displaced the Indians, the farmer starts displacing the cattlemen. And in Shane, this bad rancher is killing the farmers and being very mean to them. Here comes this lone cowboy riding in from out of the west, takes on the bad guys, kills the gunslinger, chases off the ranchers, the bad ones, and then leaves, takes off, rides into the sunset, leaving the place safe for democracy, leaving the country safe for civilization. How did that figure get started? In real life, a lot of the cowboys were about outlaw or more. They tended to be loners. They tended to be sort of anti-person, anti-people. How did this figure get to be such an iconic figure in America? I have a theory. America prides itself on being a nation of laws. That everyone in this country, that the law is supreme. The highest appeal in this country is to the Supreme Court. The highest appeal in foreign countries, particularly the countries we came from, where we had a king, the highest judge, the highest appeal was to the king. Here it is not to the leader of the country, not to the president, it is to the court. That's the ideal. We value the law above all else. At least we give lip service to the law above all else. That we also, so if you do wrong, the law is going to get you and you deserve what you receive from the judgment of the law. But some people are getting away with murder, with robbery, with bad stuff. What happens with them? The Shane character, the lone cowboy, will come into an area. He'll take on the bad guys. He'll defeat them, sometimes by breaking the law himself. He will take the law in his own hands and he will fight off the bad guys, bring peace, bring prosperity, bring the elements that can bring prosperity, set up the country right. So by violating the law, by going outside the law occasionally, but in a good way, acting according to a higher law, maybe not the one on the books, but the cowboy, in defiance of the written law, can bring good, can bring peace to an area and make it possible for the real law to get established. I think that's why the cowboy has become this icon in our society. And as I said, without Kansas, no cowboy. We still have a lot of them. Something like 8 or 10, 12 cowboys, cowgirls have been national champions at the working cowboy ranch rodeo down in Texas. Of the 3 Kansas teams have won that, they become national champions. This is still cowboy country. Yeah, we're the wheat state, but the Flint Hills, the Smoky Hills, the High Plains, still Gypsum Hills, Medicine Lodge, were still cowboy country. So you got the pioneer farmer, you got the American Indian, you have the cowboy, all heavily connected with, all developing or related to Kansas. So we have pretty good roots there, I think, pretty good system. So to recap here, we have interesting stories. We've had interesting people. We've had a president from the United States from Kansas. We've had some excellent lawmakers back east, Nancy Kassebaum, Bob Dole. We've had leaders of industry, the airline industry and others too. In many ways, William Allen White was right. If it's going to happen, it'll happen first in Kansas. And we also have that solid, unassuming, non-flashy character. That do your duty, do what you're supposed to do, get the job done character. And that's why I think Kansas is important, that the image of Kansas is important. I think that's why I hope you all celebrated Kansas Day yesterday, and we're celebrating it today, the day after. And that's about it. I'll take any questions if anybody has any.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Jim. It was like sitting at the feet of your favorite professor. It was wonderful.
Well, thank you very much.
I want to have coffee with you to sit and talk more. I want to know how long you were in Australia.
3 different times.
Because Joe and I were there from 72 to 75.
Oh, wow. You 3 years. I just saw 3 different sabbaticals.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll talk about that sometime.
You bet.
But I wanted to say something about the Cowboys. I think probably a lot of us online here have been to the Kansas, I don't remember now what it's called, the Prairie, concert on the Prairie, Symphony on the Prairie.
Symphony in the Flint Hills.
In the Flint Hills, yes. I have only been there once, but that beginning where they have the Cowboys run, do they do that every time? The Cowboys run across the
drive cattle through there.
Yeah, the cattle drive.
Yeah, they did that first, about the 6th, I think, maybe it was the 4th or 5th year. They had it at the south of Council Grove, and that's the first time they did it. And that
may have been the time. It was just.
Well, they've done it every year since.
Oh, great!
They do it every year since. That was the first year.
I'm sitting there. It is so incredible. It is breathtaking.
Yeah.
I am there in tears.
Huh.
And my husband turns to me and says, "What's the matter?" And I said, "I'm sorry." When I could get my breath, it's like watching my grandpa. My grandpa was at 19, was part of a cattle drive to Wyoming.
Huh.
So it just more than warms my Kansas heart when I see that.
Well, I'll tell you what.
And if nobody has ever done that, do it.
I'm gonna tell you something here. You have to write up your grandfather's story of driving those cattle there. Give it to Walt. Walt will get it to me. Okay? Because I collect those kinds of stories.
I don't know that I know much more of the story than that. I may have to see if my aunt, because those people have died.
That's right. See what you can find, and give it whatever you can find. Give it to Walt, and he'll get it to me. Yeah, but after that first year they did that cattle drive, as I say, they've done it every year since. And 1 or 2 years they've actually imported longhorn cattle to drive. But that first year they did it in just southeast of Council Grove, the cattle about got away from the guys. Now I could recognize that. A lot of people just thought it was all part of it. And afterwards I heard people say things like, how often did they have to rehearse that? And were those real cattle? I mean, some city slickers are really slickered. Those are real cattle. Yeah.
Well, but the other thing that impressed me so much is not just the cowboys. Those horses
Oh, yeah.
were amazingly. They were doing the work. They were
Oh, yeah.
amazing.
That's what a cow horse
So
does.
that's yeah.
If you got to
So
go
there's a
there,
lot of
you have
things
a
I
good-
like to watch.
if you have a good horse, you don't have to do anything. Just sit on
Yeah.
him
Yeah.
or her.
Thank you so much.
You're
Dr.
welcome.
Hoy.
You're welcome.
Hi, Jim. My
Yes.
name, my name is Beth Forster. You may know my husband, Kent Forster. I did not know in today's program that you would give the history of my parents and my grandparents who are Mennonite, who brought the red turkey seed wheat. My parents were born on a farm and my grandparents farmed. So technically, I'm the
In
first
Kansas.
in Kansas.
Yeah.
I'm the first generation off the farm.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I just was really pleased to hear about that.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah. Well, we had Mennonite neighbors down at Cassidy where I grew up, and then I've known a lot of them and worked with a lot of them, and you drive through the countryside, you see a junky looking farmstead, probably English or French or German background. If it's nice and neat, probably a Mennonite background. Yeah, that is true. That's my experience.
Thank you for an excellent program.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, Jim, I'm real interested in what you learned about Australian cowboy music.
Oh my gosh, they got a folk song tradition over there. And some of them are about the drovers and about the stockmen, but a lot of them are about the what we'd call a homesteader, the guys that go out and start the little farms and stuff. A lot of them, like ours, outlaw music. I mean, we have Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Sam Best, all the outlaws that have folk songs. It's interesting. You have to be a pretty damn poor outlaw to not have a folk song about you. You can be the best lawman in the world and not get a folk song. I have know of no folk songs about a marshal, about a sheriff. I mean, Wild Bill Hickok, guy there in Wichita and out Tombstone, who am I thinking of?
Wyatt Earp.
Wyatt Earp. You'd think they'd have folk songs. They don't. But Jesse James and even the Flegel gang out of Garden City, Kansas, who were just scum, they got a folk song. We glorify outlaws. They do that in Australia too. They're outlaws, they're bushrangers, Ben Hall and Frank Gardner and those guys all have folk songs. They really, and they glorify. Back in the, I think it was 2000, Sydney had the Olympics, and then an opening ceremony. A part of the opening ceremony, there was a group of Australian with armor, kind of armor on their head and chest. That's what the Kelly gang did. Ned Kelly got his gang members to fashion armor out of farm implements for a head and chest when they made their last stand. And you know, he was walking out, and the traps shooting him, bang, bing, bing, bing. And they finally realized, oh, he's got something on his chest. They shot him in the leg to bring him down. But yeah, Ned Kelly's a national icon, a national hero, like Jesse James or Billy the Kid is here. You know, they love their outlaws. Yeah.
Yeah, we, Jim, you and I could do a program. I'll do the music and you do the folk tales.
Okay. We're Walt too. Walt's a good musician. Yeah.
Hi, Jim.
Yeah.
My name's Don Cronus here. I grew up outside of Abilene, Kansas on
Yeah.
a farm ranch, and we had about 300 head and a couple sections of grass.
Yeah.
far through that process, and the roundups, as far as when we were bringing cattle home, I found that you basically tired out the cattle, and that eventually they would get back in into the corrals and ready to load them out. But I went home every year for many, many years at Thanksgiving time, and that's when we'd bring the cattle in as far as off a pasture, and it was
For the winter?
one of my most fun experiences of growing up.
Yeah.
It was when it was time to bring them in.
Well, I got a couple of good Abilene stories. Years ago, the State Historical Society did a exhibit of cowboy boots. Kansas, the first boot maker was from Kansas, from Olathe, as a matter of fact. Charles Hire. Anyway, had this special exhibit about the Kansas being the home of the cowboy boot, and this Texan visiting that exhibit complained. He said, but says the cowboy and Abilene are the main thing, and that Abilene's where the cowboy originated and so on. The cowboy boot had to have originated in Abilene. And they said, well, yeah, he says, this good Texan says, well, Abilene's in Texas. He didn't know that Abilene, Kansas was the cow town. And another one, talking to a friend, this several years ago, and she had a friend who lived in Arizona who's going to come visit her, and she didn't show, and she didn't show, and she didn't show. She finally got a phone call and said, where are you? Why aren't you here to greet me at the airport? And this woman says, we don't have any airport at Abilene. He says, well, there's a big one here. He's in Abilene, Texas, waiting for his friend from Abilene, Kansas to pick him up. Okay, anyhow.
Well,
Other
Jim, that's
questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead.
that's been a real treat. Well, I can't thank you enough for sharing all this insight and history and bringing it right home just in time for right after Kansas Day. So I think with your interest in folk music, we're going to close with Kansas, as you probably know, is the only state that has a traditional, authentic folk song. And Home on the Range is our song. This is a new recording that David Schaefer found. So we'll close it out with that. Is that right? Where's my volume here?
Seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play. Seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not
I can't find the. I'm looking for the volume.
Often at night, when the heavens are bright, with the light from the glittering lights, have I stood there amazed, and I asked as I gazed if their glory exceeds that earth finds. Home, home on the range,
My closing poem is by Emily Dickinson, who probably never saw a prairie. It's called To Make a Prairie. To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee. One clover and a bee and reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few. Thank you, Dr. Hoy, and everyone else for joining us. You're welcome to stay and visit and have coffee.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'll get back home now.
Thank
Hey.
you.
Hi,
Thank
Jim.
you. Great.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Jim.
Join us here next week. Same bat station, same bat time.
I think we're gonna close it down then.
All righty then. Take care, Walt.
Thanks. Thank you, David.
Absolutely.